Why did no one move when her face hit the dirt? Dust hung in the morning air at Fort Garrison, lit by the pale gray light of dawn. 40 recruits stood in rigid formation, but all eyes were on one. The smaller one. The one who seemed misplaced in a sea of square jaws and heavy shoulders. Master Sergeant Thorne Redgrave loomed over her like a shadow given form, his presence dominating the field even before he spoke. His voice was sharp enough to cut through bone. He mocked her height, her build, the very idea of her being here at all. Then, without warning, he grabbed her by the collar, yanked her forward, and slammed her face first into the hard-packed earth. The sound carried dull, final, humiliating. Some recruits stifled nervous laughs, more out of fear than cruelty. Others shifted their gaze to the horizon, pretending not to witness what had just happened. That was the rule here. Don't get involved, don't draw attention, don't let his eyes fall on you. But then something broke the silence. Her hands. They planted firmly into the ground, steady, precise, like she was pushing against more than dirt. And with a calmness that unsettled even those who had mocked her moments ago, she rose. Not stumbling, not shaken, rising with a measured strength that didn't belong to someone new, someone untrained. Redgrave hadn't expected it, neither had the formation. She moved with a practiced rhythm, executing a counter-sequence too fluid for luck. In one seamless motion, the sergeant's grip was broken, and his balance was gone. A heartbeat later, the towering man was on the ground, pinned, staring up at the very recruit he had tried to bury. No one laughed now. For one suspended moment, the base was silent except for the wind and the crunch of boots shifting in disbelief. And in that silence, something invisible cracked, the unspoken rule that she was weak, unworthy, doomed to fail. No one would forget this morning. And yet she said nothing. No victory cry, no smirk. She simply released him, straightened her stance, and returned to formation. Her composure was almost unsettling, like she hadn't just done what every other recruit secretly wished they could, stand up to him and survive it. But why had she been able to? And why, behind her calm eyes, was there something colder, something she wasn't showing them? Fort Garrison wasn't just a base, it was a crucible. Concrete and steel, all sharp edges against the bleak horizon, built not to inspire but to intimidate. Dawn here didn't rise with warmth, it broke like a hammer, forcing the day upon everyone. The recruits stood stiff, breath visible in the chill. Instructors prowled between them, voices carrying, each step calculated to remind them, you were not soldiers yet, you were clay, and clay had to be broken before it could be remade. Brier Merrick stood among them, smaller shoulders tucked into the same fatigues, helmet obscuring much of her face. She looked ordinary, at least at a glance, average in build, neither the slowest nor the strongest, always middle of the pack. But there was something different, if anyone bothered to look closer. Her stance was too exact, her breathing too controlled, her silence too deliberate. She didn't shake under Redgrave's gaze. She didn't crack when singled out for punishment. She absorbed it all quietly, carefully. And yet silence has a weight, sometimes heavier than words. Redgrave's reputation was carved into the bones of this place. He was the instructor who produced the most soldiers, the hardest fighters. He broke recruits until there was nothing left but obedience. Other instructors deferred to him, not just because of rank but because of the aura he carried. He believed cruelty was the only teacher, and if you survived him, you were worthy of wearing the uniform. He had been waiting for someone like Brier. During the equipment check, he found her pack too precise, too perfect. He didn't praise it. He tore it apart, every folded piece of gear thrown into the dirt for everyone to see. Problem with attention to detail, Merrick. His voice carried sharp enough for 3 platoons to hear. Details get soldiers killed. Her response was flat by the book. Yes, Sergeant. Nothing more. That answer, that refusal to crack, was the beginning of something worse. He had found a target. Around her, recruits exchanged subtle glances. They'd seen it before. Once Redgrave set his sights, you either broke or you were gone. "She's not lasting the week," whispered Zephyr Watts, a wiry recruit filling canteens. "Poor thing's already marked." "What's her story anyway?" another asked. "Nobody knows. She keeps to herself. Not the worst, not the best, just there. Just there, invisible, ordinary, unremarkable." But wasn't that the safest way to survive training? To be unseen? And yet Redgrave noticed her. Noticed her enough to pull at the seams of her silence. Later at the wall climb, her first attempt failed. Her boots slipped, palms sliding off rain-slick wood. Before she could reset, Redgrave's presence was suddenly behind her, suffocating. "Problem with gravity, Merrick," his words cut deep. "Or just problem with being where you don't belong." The formation chuckled under its breath, safe in the herd. Brier didn't respond. She didn't argue. She simply looked at the wall again. This time her technique was different. Not the brute pull-and kick everyone else used. Something sharper, cleaner. Not regulation, but effective. She crested the wall slower than the others, but with a precision that drew suspicion. Redgrave's eyes narrowed. She wasn't just a weak recruit. She was something else. Something he couldn't quite name yet. That evening in the mess hall, Brier sat alone, tray untouched, the buzz of voices filling the hall, until someone broke the silence. Aurora Pike. Bruised, exhausted, but defiant in her own way, Aurora slid onto the bench across from her. "You're handling him better than most," she said quietly. "I'm not handling anything," Brier replied flatly. "Just doing what's required." Aurora studied her. "Well, whatever you're doing, keep doing it. The last 3 he singled out didn't make it past week 5. Her words carried weight. This wasn't just training. This was survival. Then Redgrave appeared again, like a shadow that refused to leave them. He targeted Aurora this time, uniform violation, punishment, correction. She left her food untouched, a small photo slipping from her pocket as she moved away. Brier reached down, retrieving it. It was Aurora, standing proudly beside another female soldier in graduation attire. Both smiling, both alive in a way the present training hadn't allowed. For a moment Brier's face shifted. The neutral mask cracked. Something in her eyes flickered recognition, maybe even pain. And then it was gone. Back to silence. By week 6, everyone knew Brier had been chosen. Redgrave piled her with heavier packs, longer duties, harsher words. Yet she never rose above the middle, never excelled enough to escape notice, never failed enough to be thrown out. It was deliberate, a balancing act. And Redgrave hated it. During combat drills, he used her as an example, throwing her harder than necessary, mocking her every move. Each time she hit the ground, he asked if she was ready to quit. Each time she got back up, silent. He began digging into her file. Officer candidate school, failed psychological evaluations, a history of doubtful stress tolerance. He spat the words in front of everyone, twisting truth into a weapon. And yet she endured. But not everyone was fooled. Lieutenant Marlo Saleri watched from the sidelines. Her trained eyes caught what Redgrave missed. The moment Brier almost countered, almost revealed something advanced before pulling back. She wasn't just surviving, she was hiding. Why? And from who? The question lingered. Why would someone capable of countering Redgrave stay silent? Why endure humiliation instead of revealing her hand? There was an answer, but she wasn't ready to give it, not yet. All anyone knew was that the smaller recruit refused to break, refused to speak, refused to quit. And silence was sometimes more dangerous than defiance. Because silence waited, and silence planned. And somewhere deep inside, beneath the dirt, beneath the bruises, beneath the facade of just another recruit, something stronger was waiting to rise. Something Redgrave could not control. Why did she take his punishment without a word? By week 6, the training yard had become a stage, and every recruit knew the script. Redgrave barked. Redgrave broke. The recruits obeyed or they disappeared, but Brier didn't fit the rhythm. She bent without breaking, obeyed without surrendering, survived without showing the cost. And that unsettled him. That morning, the platoon gathered for combat readiness drills. The pit was cold and hard, the kind of ground meant to sap energy before a fight even began. Redgrave scanned the ranks, eyes searching for weakness. His gaze landed predictably on her. Merrick stepped forward. She did perfectly measured steps, no hesitation. "You will demonstrate proper defensive technique," he announced, voice carrying like a verdict. What followed wasn't a demonstration. It was a spectacle. He threw her to the ground again and again, using more force than regulation allowed. Each impact cracked against the dirt, sharp enough to make recruits flinch. Each time he asked if she'd had enough. Each time she answered the same way, not with words but by standing back up. It wasn't resilience he wanted. It was collapse, but she denied him that satisfaction. Between throws, Redgrave circled her like a predator savoring its meal. His voice cut deeper than his grip. "I looked into your record," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Failed officer candidate school, psychological evaluation flagged, stress tolerance questionable." He twisted facts into knives. His tone told the recruits exactly how they should see her: weak, unstable, unfit. Some recruits smirked nervously, others looked away. But one didn't. Lieutenant Marlowe Salari, watching from the sidelines, caught something he missed. On the third throw, as Redgrave drove her down, Brier's body had shifted, not clumsy, not desperate, but calculated. A subtle positioning, an advanced counter she abandoned halfway through, letting him slam her into the dirt instead. Salari's eyes narrowed. She wasn't failing, she was choosing. Why? And what was she hiding? That night, Redgrave gathered Brier's squad for a special exercise. His punishments always had a noble disguise: extra training, remedial drills, team responsibility. But everyone knew what it was: another way to grind her down. Heavy equipment strapped to their backs, they were marched into the mud under a sky that showed no stars. 3 hours of slogging through terrain designed to break legs and spirits. Every step a test. When Danner, one of the younger recruits, collapsed face first in the muck, the squad froze. No one dared move. If Redgrave wanted a body left behind, so be it. But Brier didn't hesitate. She dropped beside him, hoisted his load onto her shoulders in one clean motion, and kept moving. No complaint, no pause. Her frame seemed too small for the extra weight, but her stance shifted, finding balance, adjusting, surviving. The others saw it, and something began to change. Her quiet endurance, the way she bore more without breaking, started to ripple through the squad. Recruits who had stumbled found steadiness in her pace. Those ready to quit clenched their jaws and pushed forward. By the end of the march, they weren't just individuals being broken apart. They were a unit. Redgrave had intended to punish them. Instead, he had forged something he didn't expect: a cohesion. And cohesion was dangerous. Redgrave's eyes burned with frustration. He wanted to shatter her, but her silence infected the others. The harder he pushed, the more they rallied, not around him, but around her. He doubled down. Her packs grew heavier, her chores longer, criticisms harsher, always her, never anyone else. He pressed until his cruelty became obvious, too obvious to ignore. Yet she remained in the middle, never best, never worst, always average, too steady. It gnawed at him, because there was nothing average about her eyes. In the shadows, Salari moved quietly. While Redgrave targeted Brier in daylight, the lieutenant dug at her past at night. She pulled her records, cross-checked verification points. Background data was clean, too precise. But inconsistencies showed beneath the surface. Dates that almost matched but not quite. Locations that seemed plausible until traced further. Subtle things most would overlook, but to Salari they glowed like warning lights. She fed her suspicions into the database, searching for a match. The system came back empty. No match. No history, as though Brier Merrick didn't exist before she put on the uniform. But Salari had seen her stance, seen the almost counter. That wasn't the movement of a raw recruit. That was training, advanced training. The kind you didn't just forget. So who was she? Meanwhile, Redgrave's fixation grew sharper. He wasn't just punishing anymore. He was probing, testing, looking for cracks in her armor. And cracks are easiest to find when you press where it hurts most. The mud crawl came near the end of training, barbed wire stretched low, earth wet and heavy. Recruits dragged themselves forward, mud clogging their nostrils, grit grinding into their teeth. Brier moved steady, focused, her face inches from the muck. And then Redgrave placed his boot between her shoulder blades and pressed her into the mud. Hard. The recruits froze. None dared speak. Her face sank into the waterlogged soil, breath cut off, seconds stretched, too long, far too long. When he finally lifted his boot, she surfaced gasping, mud caked across her face, hair plastered to her skin. But instead of fear, her eyes burned with something else, something colder. Redgrave crouched low, close enough that only she could hear. His voice was poison in her ear. "You'll quit, Merrick, just like your sister should have before she took the coward's way out." The words detonated silently between them. And for the first time, her mask cracked wide. The calm determination vanished, replaced by something sharper, a blade unsheathed. Not anger, not despair, purpose. The kind of purpose that doesn't let go. Salari, watching from the edge of the field, saw it. She whispered into her radio, calm but certain. "It's time, prepare the documentation." But the recruits didn't know that. All they saw was the girl who should have broken long ago, staring down the man who had tried to drown her in the mud. Her silence no longer looked like weakness. It looked like warning. Night fell heavy. The barracks were restless with whispers. "Did you see her eyes?" someone murmured. "She should have been gone weeks ago," another replied. "Why is she still standing?" Aurora Pike, bruised but unbroken, said nothing. But she watched Brier across the bunks, watched the way she sat perfectly still, mud-streaked uniform still clinging to her skin. Aurora had seen plenty of recruits break. She had felt Redgrave's cruelty herself, but she had never seen someone rise from it with eyes like that. Eyes that promised something was coming. Something none of them were prepared for. Redgrave thought he was breaking her. But what if he was revealing her? What if every humiliation, every throw, every cruel word was sharpening a blade he wouldn't be able to control? And what if she wasn't the one on trial here? What if he was? How far can a body be pushed before it breaks? The recruits asked themselves that question daily, even if none spoke it aloud. Training at Fort Garrison was designed to answer it, miles run until lungs bled, drills repeated until muscles quivered, punishments layered until exhaustion felt like the only constant. But with Redgrave, the line blurred. Training wasn't the enemy. He was. And the longer it went on, the clearer it became that his cruelty wasn't about shaping soldiers. It was about control. Everyone saw it now, everyone except Redgrave. He believed he was the storm. But storms don't realize when they've stopped terrifying people and started teaching them to endure. The morning after the mud crawl, the platoon stood assembled in silence. Dust clung to uniforms, eyes heavy from lack of sleep. Redgrave prowled in front of them, packing like a caged animal. His rage wasn't hidden anymore. The humiliation of the night before, her refusal to break, the flicker of defiance he'd seen in her eyes had lodged under his skin. He needed to reassert dominance, and he knew how. The combat training pit. It was an ancient tradition at Fort Garrison, a sand-filled circle where recruits proved themselves before their peers. Part lesson, part theater, part reminder of who held the power. "This," he barked, his voice cracking across the formation, "is where we separate soldiers from uniforms. This is where we see who belongs and who doesn't." His eyes locked on her, always her. Merrick's center pit. The silence that followed was suffocating. No one moved, but every recruit's heart jumped the same way. She can't survive this. But she stepped forward anyway, calm as ever. Each footfall deliberate, controlled. She stood across from him, smaller by nearly a foot, lighter by at least 70 pounds. She didn't flinch. And yet, if anyone looked close enough, they'd see it. The tiniest shifts in her stance, the subtle coiling of balance, not the awkward uncertainty of a recruit, the readiness of someone who had been here before. The sand seemed to sense it too. From the edge of the crowd, Lieutenant Salari watched carefully. Her suspicions had crystallized into certainty. This wasn't an ordinary recruit. Brier Merrick wasn't who she claimed to be. The question wasn't if she was hiding something. The question was why. And why here, why now? Salari's eyes flicked to the hidden cameras she'd ordered set up days before, positioned in plain sight to those who knew where to look. They had captured every moment of Redgrave's training. The files were damning already. But this, what was about to happen in the pit, would be decisive. She didn't intervene. Not yet. She needed the truth to reveal itself. Redgrave circled Brier like a predator, the crowd silent around them. "This exercise determines if you have what it takes," he announced. His tone suggested this wasn't just evaluation, it was execution. At first he moved like it was standard demonstration. A shove, a throw, a calculated display of dominance. But the aggression ramped quickly. His blows were sharper, his force beyond regulation. Every strike was meant to humiliate. But humiliation didn't land when the target refused to acknowledge it. She took the hits, absorbed the falls, rose again with maddening composure. The other instructors shifted uneasily. They saw the line being crossed, but none stepped forward. To challenge Redgrave was to risk career suicide, so they stood in silence, complicit. The recruits felt it too, the unease, the sick knowledge that this wasn't training anymore. And still she endured. Then came the moment that would change everything. Redgrave caught her by the collar, spun her, and slammed her face first into the dirt. Dust exploded upward. The crowd gasped. A few recruits laughed nervously, the sound quickly dying in their throats. He pressed a knee into her back, pinning her. The pit fell silent. He leaned low, voice dripping venom meant for her ears alone. "This is where you quit, Merrick, just like your pathetic sister should have, before she took the coward's way out." The words sliced sharper than any blow. The crowd couldn't hear them, but they saw the change. Brier's body stilled beneath him, but it wasn't surrender. It was coiling, focusing. Her eyes opened in the dirt, no longer calm, no longer hidden. Cold, razor sharp. And then she moved. Hands planted, body pivoted, momentum harnessed in one perfect sequence. The counter wasn't desperation. It was mastery. Redgrave's grip broke. His balance evaporated. And in less than 3 heartbeats, the towering sergeant was pinned flat in the sand, his own arm locked against him with a precision that screamed of advanced combat training. Gasps rippled through the formation. Instructors stepped forward instinctively, recognition flashing across their faces before they caught themselves. The silence that followed wasn't confusion, it was revelation. Who was she? Redgrave roared, face twisting with rage, humiliation burning in his eyes. He scrambled against her hold, but she released him deliberately, stepping back with soldier's precision. She didn't gloat, didn't celebrate. She stood at attention, breathing even, expression neutral once more. But everyone had seen it. That wasn't luck, that wasn't instinct, that was training, real training. And suddenly all the whispers made sense. The odd stance, The quiet composure, the impossible resilience. She wasn't just another recruit. She had never been just another recruit. The silence broke with a single voice. "Captain Brier Merrick, stand down." The words cracked across the formation like thunder. Lieutenant Salari stepped forward, her authority undeniable. The recruits turned as one, staring, uncertain whether they had heard correctly. "Captain." Brier didn't hesitate. She snapped to attention. "Yes, Lieutenant." The confirmation detonated through the pit. The truth wasn't whispered anymore. It was real. The smaller recruit who had endured everything was no recruit at all. She was an officer, a captain, and she had been here undercover. The recruits looked from her to Redgrave, disbelief transforming into understanding. Weeks of cruelty, humiliation, and whispered threats had been documented, witnessed, exposed. And the predator now looked very small in the pit he had once commanded. "Captain Merrick," Salari continued, her voice carrying to every corner of the yard, "was deployed undercover following multiple reports of unauthorized abuse and harassment at Fort Garrison. Everything she has endured has been recorded. Everything she has witnessed will be reported to command." Gasps rippled through the formation again. Aurora Pike's face shifted, bruises still visible at her collar. She stepped forward without hesitation. "She's not lying," Aurora said, voice shaking but strong. "The punishment, the extra sessions, he targeted us." 3 other female recruits followed, voices trembling as they added their testimony. The silence was broken, and once silence breaks, it never returns the same. Redgrave sputtered, his voice desperate now. "This is ridiculous. They weren't meeting standards. Everything I did was approved protocol." Was holding her face underwater until she nearly lost consciousness. "Approved protocol," Salari cut in sharply. His face faltered. Was mocking her sister's death and using it as leverage. Approved protocol. The question sliced through what remained of his defense. Around the pit, recruits and instructors alike felt the balance shift. Authority was no longer his. And then above them all, another voice. "Enough." Colonel Ursa Wyndham, base commander, stepped into view. Her presence carried the weight of decades. Behind her, military police waited. The colonel's expression was stone. Controlled fury simmered in her eyes. "Sergeant Redgrave," she said, her voice level, "you are hereby suspended pending investigation. You will surrender your post immediately." Redgrave's protests faltered. He shouted about standards, about discipline, about the soldiers he had built. But Colonel Wyndham cut him down with one sentence. "Discipline builds soldiers, cruelty breaks them. You've forgotten the difference." The MPs moved in. The predator was led away. The recruits remained at attention, silent, processing the collapse of the man who had defined their every waking moment. And Brier Merrick, no longer hidden, stood revealed. Not a recruit, not just a survivor, a captain. And behind her silence, a story still untold. Why had she done this? Why risk so much? The answer wasn't yet given, but it lingered in her eyes, heavy with grief, sharp with purpose. The truth would come. And when it did, it wouldn't just explain her. It would indict the system itself. What happens after the monster is unmasked. The pit was still. Dust floated in the late light, hanging like memory itself. Redgrave was gone now, escorted in shackles of authority he could no longer command. Yet the silence remained heavy, as though the ground still carried his shadow. 40 recruits stood in rigid formation, but their focus had shifted. For weeks, their eyes had been trained on him, fearing when he might single them out. Now their gaze settled on her, the one who had endured, the one who had risen, the one who had pinned him without hesitation. Brier Merrick, no longer recruit, captain. She hadn't changed in appearance. Her frame was the same. Her silence still wrapped around her like armor, but everything was different. The mask had dropped, and in its place stood the truth. The recruits wanted answers. Why had she come among them? Why had she let herself be thrown, humiliated, mocked, broken down with the rest of them? Why hadn't she revealed herself earlier? But she gave no explanations, not yet. The next hours unfolded like a storm behind closed doors. Colonel Wyndham gathered her staff. Lieutenant Salari presented files, recordings, testimonies. Weeks of cruelty laid bare in black and white, evidence too overwhelming to ignore. When Brier entered the commander's office, she was no longer in fatigues of a recruit. Her true uniform fit like second skin. The insignia of a captain gleamed at her collar, catching light that had not touched her in weeks. Her salute was crisp, her bearing precise, but her eyes carried something weightier than protocol. Colonel Wyndham studied her carefully. "You've caused quite a stir, Captain." "Wasn't my intention," Brier replied evenly. "And yet here we are." The colonel gestured to the chair opposite her desk. "Sit, tell me why." Brier hesitated only a moment before obeying. She removed a folder from her pack, thick, weathered, worn at the edges like something carried close for too long. She placed it gently on the desk. The colonel opened it, scanning the contents. Reports, names, patterns of abuse across multiple facilities, all buried, all dismissed. "This started long before Fort Garrison," Brier said quietly. Wyndham looked up. "How far back?" Brier's jaw tightened. 2 years, Fort Dalton. The name lingered heavy in the air. "My sister Sorrel trained there," she continued, voice controlled but taut. "She reported harassment, beatings passed off as corrective discipline, extra sessions targeted at female recruits. When she requested transfer, her complaints disappeared. Instead, the pressure on her increased. By the time anyone noticed, it was too late." Her hands remained still, but her eyes betrayed the weight behind her words. "She was 21, Brier said softly. "She didn't survive it." The colonel closed the file slowly, her expression unreadable. "I began digging after her death, quietly at first, gathering what I could. At every base the same story, complaints buried, instructors transferred rather than investigated, a cycle repeating itself, each time leaving more scars behind." She leaned forward now, voice carrying the edge of steel. "I wasn't supposed to come here. I wasn't assigned. But when the reports surfaced about Redgrave, I had enough evidence to demand attention. General Hargrove authorized the operation, but off the record. Too many in the chain of command had ties to these instructors. Too many had something to lose if the truth came out." The colonel listened, silent, her face like stone. "I wasn't here to prove myself," Brier finished. "I was here to prove them, to catch them in the act, and to make sure what happened to Sorrel doesn't happen again." Her words settled heavy in the room. Wyndham exhaled, long and slow. "You understand what you've done, Captain?" she asked finally. Brier's gaze didn't waver. "Yes, ma'am." "You've embarrassed this command, you've broken chain of trust, but—" the colonel's eyes softened almost imperceptibly. "You've also forced us to confront what we ignored. Discipline builds soldiers, cruelty destroys them, and we have allowed too much destruction." For a long moment, nothing moved but the ticking of the clock. Then the colonel closed the file and set it aside. "Very well, we move forward." When the recruits were assembled again, the air felt different. No longer fear, no longer oppression, something fragile and new. Colonel Wyndham stood before them, her presence commanding. "The greatest strength of this military is not its weapons," she began, her voice carrying across the field. "It is its people. How we train them reflects who we are, and in this we have failed you." She gestured toward Brier, now in full uniform, insignia gleaming. "Captain Merrick was sent here to expose what we allowed to fester. She has done so, and because of her this training program will change." Her words weren't dramatic. They didn't need to be. They landed with the force of truth long denied. The recruits saluted, not Redgrave, not the broken system, but her. And for the first time in weeks, Some of them stood a little taller. Later that evening, Aurora Pike approached her quietly. Her face still bore the marks of Redgrave's corrections, but her eyes were alive with something new. "Thank you," she said simply. Brier studied her. For what? For not breaking, for proving we weren't imagining it, for believing us when nobody else would. Brier shook her head softly. "You did the hard part. Standing up after being knocked down takes more courage than most people ever understand." Aurora hesitated, then reached into her pocket. She pulled out the small photograph Brier had found weeks earlier. Two women, smiling in graduation uniforms, Aurora and another recruit. But this time, Aurora flipped the photo. On the back, scrawled in fading ink, was a name. Sorrel Merrick. Brier's eyes softened. The resemblance was undeniable. "She was your sister," Aurora whispered. Brier didn't deny it. She simply closed her hand gently over the photo. "She would have been proud of you," Aurora said, her voice trembling. Brier didn't answer. Some truth sat too deep for words. The weeks that followed were different. Investigations spread beyond Fort Garrison. Files reopened. Instructors who had walked away clean were called back in shackles. The buried became unburied. And at the center of it all stood Brier, not as hero, not as savior, but as the quiet reminder that silence can hold more power than cruelty ever could. She didn't soften the training. She didn't make it easy. She simply made it fair. And recruits, both men and women, rose to meet the challenge in ways Redgrave had never allowed them to. The numbers spoke for themselves. More finished the course. More passed qualification. More stood ready to wear the uniform with dignity. Because discipline built soldiers, and cruelty broke them. One evening, long after lights out, Brier walked alone across the training ground. The pit lay empty now, the sand smooth, the dust settled. She stood at its edge, remembering the moment her silence finally ended, remembering her sister's last message, a voice no one had heard until too late. The night was quiet, but in the stillness she could almost hear Sorrel's voice. "If they succeed in silencing me, I hope someone else will speak louder." Brier closed her eyes. "I spoke," she whispered softly into the night. And for the first time since her sister's death, she felt the faintest sense of peace. Not closure, not yet, but something close. Change had begun. But change, she knew, was only ever the beginning. What happens to soldiers when the ground beneath them finally shifts? Graduation day approached at Fort Garrison, but the air was no longer poisoned with dread. The recruits stood taller now, not because training had grown easier, it hadn't. The obstacle courses still burned their muscles raw. The drills still dragged their lungs toward collapse. The standards remained merciless. But cruelty had left the field. And the absence of it was like breathing clean air after weeks of choking. They didn't fear failure anymore. They feared disappointing themselves. It was a different kind of weight, heavier but purer. And the one who had carried the heaviest weight of all now walked among them openly. Captain Brier Merrick. No longer silent, no longer pretending to be less. Her presence was a reminder. Strength could be demanded without humiliation, discipline without destruction. The reforms began small, almost invisible. Anonymous reporting lines, additional oversight officers at drills, regular check-ins with mental health staff who actually listened. For the first time, recruits whispered to each other about violations without fear of retaliation. Their whispers reached ears willing to hear. It wasn't about coddling. It was about protection of dignity, of morale, of the uniform itself. Brier knew she couldn't rewrite the system overnight, but she could start where she was. "The goal isn't to shield them from hardship," she told her new cadre of instructors. "It's to make sure hardship serves a purpose. If you push someone, push them toward strength, not despair. Push them toward unity, not isolation. Fear is cheap. It burns fast and leaves nothing but ash. But pressure, used the right way, forges steel. The instructors listened, some with respect, some with skepticism. But all of them saw the results. The recruits who had once teetered on collapse now stood as a unit, leaner and stronger than the ones Redgrave had claimed to build. Data didn't lie, but neither did the eyes of soldiers who no longer looked like prey. Aurora Pike became the face of the change for many, no longer hunched under bruises, no longer silenced by the threat of punishment. She spoke with a steadiness that surprised even herself. When Colonel Wyndham addressed the company on graduation day, Aurora's name was called. She stepped forward with pride, insignia pinned to her chest. Her salute was crisp, but her eyes found Brier, and for a moment the ceremony fell away. It wasn't just about rank. It was about survival, about being believed. Afterward she approached Brier quietly. No words at first, just an embrace. "You believed us when nobody else did," she whispered. "That's why we're standing here." Brier returned the embrace, but her words were steady. "You did the hard part, Aurora. You endured." Aurora shook her head, emotion trembling in her voice. "We endured because you showed us it was possible." She reached into her pocket and held out the photo again. This time, she gave it to Brier. "You should have this," she said softly. Brier looked down at the worn picture, Sorrel's smile frozen in time beside Aurora's younger self. For weeks, the image had been a hidden wound. Now it felt like a promise fulfilled. "She'd be proud," Aurora said. Brier nodded, throat tight. "So would I." The ceremony that day marked more than a transition of recruits into soldiers. It marked a shift in culture, subtle but undeniable. Colonel Wyndham didn't mince words when she addressed the families and officers in attendance. "Our strength lies not in how we break our soldiers, but in how we build them," she declared. Captain Merrick's actions remind us of a truth we should never have forgotten. Cruelty does not forge warriors. It only hides the strength already within them. Strength revealed is strength that endures. Applause rippled across the grounds, but the sound carried differently. It wasn't hollow, like so many ceremonies before. It was grounded in recognition. And for the first time, recruits, especially the women who had been targets of abuse for years, felt seen. Not as problems, not as burdens, but as soldiers. Weeks turned into months. The Merrick Standards, as they quietly came to be called, spread beyond Fort Garrison. Oversight systems tightened across bases. Instructors who had built reputations on fear found themselves under review. Some were reassigned, some dismissed, a few prosecuted. Resistance existed, of course. Older voices grumbled about softness, about lowering standards. They clung to the belief that pain was the only teacher worth listening to. But statistics began to betray them. Graduation rates rose, performance scores improved, fewer injuries, fewer psychological breakdowns. Soldiers weren't just surviving training, they were excelling. The numbers told a story the doubters couldn't silence. And yet, numbers weren't the point. The point was this: the uniform was finally beginning to honor those who wore it. For Brier, the victories came with shadows. Each time she walked the grounds, she saw Sorrel in her mind. A younger face, bright with determination, swallowed by a system that had chosen cruelty over care. A system that had failed her, then buried her story. At night, Brier still opened her sister's journal. The handwriting uneven, ink smudged where tears had once fallen. Observations of drills, notes about instructors. Please scribbled between the lines, "They're not supposed to treat us this way. No one listens. Maybe if I just hold out one more week." The final entry always stopped her cold. "If they succeed in silencing me, I hope someone else will speak louder. The uniform deserves better than this." Brier would close the book, her fingers lingering on the page. "I spoke," she would whisper into the quiet, "and they finally heard us." But hearing didn't mean healing. Her sister was still gone, and some nights the reforms felt like a hollow victory. justice that had come too late for Sorrel. Yet grief, like silence, could also be forged into something stronger. Aurora became her shadow in those months, not by order, not by duty, by choice. She sought out extra training, volunteered for oversight initiatives, pressed herself harder not because she feared punishment, but because she wanted to prove herself worthy of the second chance Brier had fought to give. One evening, after a grueling exercise, Aurora approached Brier by the training pit, the same pit where everything had changed. "They call you something," Aurora admitted with a faint smile. Brier raised an eyebrow. "Do I want to know?" The steel rose. Aurora's grin grew, tough enough to withstand anything, but still a rose, unyielding but never ugly. Brier almost smiled, almost. "I've been called worse," she said. Aurora's expression softened. "They mean it with respect. It's not just about surviving you. It's about knowing you'll never humiliate us to make us stronger. You demand everything, but you don't destroy us for it. That's different. That matters." Brier looked back at the pit, her expression unreadable. Strength isn't built by breaking. It's built by revealing what's already there. Most people don't know they're stronger than they are until someone shows them. Aurora nodded. "You showed us." For the first time in weeks, Brier allowed herself to smile, faint but real. 3 months after Redgrave's removal, the recruits of Echo Company graduated. The ceremony took place on the same grounds where their spirit had once been trampled. But now, the ground felt different. Colonel Wyndham presided, flanked by Captain Merrick, no longer hidden, no longer silent. The recruits stood in formation, proud, unbroken, and whole. Families wept. Officers applauded. And for the first time in years, recruits left Fort Garrison not just as soldiers, but as survivors of a system that had begun to change. When Aurora received her insignia, she turned to the crowd, her eyes bright. And though she said nothing aloud, her glance toward Brier said everything. "We made it." And Brier, standing at attention, let the moment linger. This wasn't her victory alone. It was theirs. And in the silence that followed, the air seemed to whisper the truth her sister had once written. The uniform deserves better than this. Now, at last, it was beginning to receive it. What happens when change spreads faster than silence can contain it? 3 months after Echo Company's graduation, Fort Garrison no longer felt like the same place. The drills were just as grueling, the obstacle courses just as unforgiving, the standards just as high. But the atmosphere had shifted. The recruits no longer lived under a shadow of humiliation. Their exhaustion came from effort, not cruelty. Their fear came from pushing limits, not being destroyed for the spectacle of it. And word had spread. The Merrick Standards, as they were being called, no longer belonged to Fort Garrison alone. Bases across the country began implementing oversight measures. Anonymous reporting systems were introduced. Instructors were quietly reassigned, investigated, or removed. The results came quickly: fewer washouts, fewer breakdowns, more graduates. Soldiers emerged not just trained but whole. But change does not come without resistance. The pushback began with whispers. Old voices muttering about softness, about political correctness infecting the ranks, about soldiers who would crumble in real combat because they hadn't been broken properly in training. Those whispers grew louder. Some instructors balked at the oversight, bristling at the idea that anyone should second-guess their methods. To them, authority meant freedom to shape recruits however they wished. Now, that freedom was gone. Captain Brier Merrick knew this was inevitable. Every reform invites resistance. Every step forward casts a shadow. But she hadn't expected the resistance to sting so personally. The review board at Central Command convened 6 months into the new policies. Representatives from multiple training bases filled the room, some curious, some hostile. Charts, data, and reports lined the walls. Brier stood before them, posture flawless, uniform immaculate. She laid out the numbers: higher graduation rates, improved tactical performance, lower injury statistics. The evidence was clear. But evidence doesn't silence ideology. One instructor, Lieutenant Colonel Marrow, spoke for many of the skeptics. His voice was measured but sharp. These new standards may look good on paper, but they restrict our ability to truly prepare recruits. You talk about dignity and oversight, but war does not come with dignity. Our enemies won't file complaints. They won't care about fairness. We do them no favors by softening training. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the room. Brier didn't flinch. This isn't about making training soft, it's about making it purposeful. Discipline can prepare someone for combat. Abuse cannot. Cruelty breaks spirit, it doesn't strengthen it. The data shows this clearly. Data, Marrow scoffed, can be interpreted in many ways. I trust experience over numbers. For decades, soldiers have been forged by fire, and those soldiers won wars. Your reforms may win applause, Captain, but will they win battles? His words carried weight. Old habits die hard, especially in institutions built on tradition. But Brier didn't yield. Her voice remained steady, measured. Every soldier you break before the battlefield is one less soldier on it. Every recruit you drive to despair is one less comrade in the fight. Excellence and abuse have never been synonymous. We are not weakening the force. We are strengthening it by choosing precision over cruelty, purpose over fear. The room stilled. Not everyone was convinced, but some were listening, and sometimes listening was the first fracture in the wall. After the session, Colonel Wyndham joined her in the corridor. The older officer's stride was slower these days, but her presence remained unshaken. "You handled yourself well," Wyndham said. Brier inclined her head. "Thank you, ma'am. But don't mistake surviving that room for winning it. Change takes longer than arguments. Tradition is a stubborn enemy." Brier allowed herself the faintest sigh. "I know." Wyndham's eyes softened. "Your sister would have been proud." The words struck deeper than any criticism. For a moment, Brier's composure cracked, grief threatening to spill through, but she swallowed it back. "She deserved this years ago," she said quietly. "She deserves to be remembered for more than her death," Wyndham replied. Brier nodded, though the truth weighed heavy. For all the reforms, for all the progress, Sorrel remained a loss that no success could undo. That night, alone in her quarters, Brier opened Sorrel's journal again. The inked words blurred at the edges where her own tears had smudged them over time. "They tell us it's for our own good, that we'll thank them later, but I don't feel stronger, I just feel smaller. If they succeed in silencing me, I hope someone else will speak louder." Brier traced the words with her fingertip. "I'm speaking, Sorrel," she whispered. "And they're listening now, not enough, not fast enough, but they're listening." She closed the journal, pressing it to her chest. Grief didn't fade, it sharpened, and sometimes it cut her more deeply than any training pit ever had. Weeks later, a demonstration was arranged at Fort Carson, a direct test of the old methods against the new. 2 groups of 30 recruits, same aptitude, same physical range. One trained under traditional high-pressure, break and rebuild tactics. The other under the Merrick standards, rigorous but purposeful, with oversight and cohesion emphasized over humiliation. Observers filled the stands, military brass, civilian oversight committees, skeptical instructors. Day 5, differences emerged. The traditional group pushed hard, each recruit locked in solitary battles against exhaustion. Competition simmered, tempers flared, injuries rose, performance began to dip. The Merrick group endured the same hardships, but something was different. They functioned as a unit, lifting each other when one fell, strategizing instead of scrambling. Their exhaustion was tempered by cohesion. By the final evaluation, a simulated tactical mission, the difference was undeniable. The traditional group stumbled through, each individual pushing forward alone, coordination collapsing under pressure. The merit group moved with precision. They adapted, communicated, executed under stress. Their completion time was faster, their casualty management sharper, their decision-making clearer. The data spoke for itself. Colonel Wyndham stood beside Brier at the review panel as results were announced. "The evidence is conclusive," the chair declared. "The Merrick standards produce superior outcomes across all measurable parameters. Implementation will proceed across all branches." The murmurs that followed weren't whispers anymore. They were recognition. Lieutenant Colonel Marrow approached Brier afterward. His expression was reluctant, but his words carried sincerity. "I was prepared to dismiss this as weakness. I was wrong." Brier's reply was quiet but firm. It was never about making training easier. It was about making it purposeful. Marrow nodded once, then walked away, carrying the weight of his own reconsideration. The reforms grew beyond the military. Police academies, fire departments, even emergency services studied the Merrick standards. The idea was simple but revolutionary: hardship without humiliation, discipline without cruelty, unity without destruction. It wasn't about softness, it was about strength with purpose. And yet, for Brier, every victory felt incomplete. Each time she stood in front of recruits who were being trained with fairness, she saw Sorrel's face, saw the sister who had never lived to witness this change. The system was healing, but grief doesn't heal with it. One evening, she visited Sorrel's grave. The grass had grown long around the headstone. She knelt, placing a pair of graduation insignia on the stone, the kind Sorrel should have earned herself. "It's done," Brier whispered. "Not just here, everywhere. They'll never be allowed to bury another voice like yours." Her eyes stung, but her expression remained steady. "You were silenced," she said, "but I spoke louder." The wind stirred the grass around her, and though silence answered, it no longer felt empty. It felt like acknowledgement. Change was spreading, faster than she'd imagined. But in the shadows, resistance still waited. And Brier knew some storms don't pass. They gather, and sooner or later they return. What happens when resistance refuses to die? 2 years had passed since Fort Garrison erupted into scandal. Across the country, the Merrick standards had become more than an experiment. They were doctrine now. Training academies that once thrived on fear now operated under oversight, discipline, and unity. Graduation rates had climbed, injuries had fallen, and combat readiness had proven sharper than ever. But not everyone celebrated. For every commander who embraced the change, another quietly resisted. They followed the new policies on paper, but in practice, old habits resurfaced. The instinct to break recruits lingered, disguised in new language. The belief that humiliation built strength clung to corners of the institution like mold in shadows. And some of those shadows stretched long. Captain Brier Merrick knew this better than anyone. She had been promoted to oversee ethics across multiple facilities. Her work now extended beyond Fort Garrison, Fort Dalton, Fort Carson, Fort Holbrook. Bases that once chewed through recruits now found themselves under her quiet watch. But oversight revealed more than numbers. It revealed patterns. Resistance wasn't fatting, it was digging in. She saw it in reports phrased too carefully. Instructors who claimed discipline when the truth looked more like cruelty. Commanders who spoke the right words at review boards but ran their yards like old arenas. Everywhere she turned, someone insisted the past had been better. And sometimes, their voices found her directly. At a closed-door meeting with instructors at Fort Dalton, the place where Sorrel had once trained and suffered, one officer confronted her openly. "These recruits will face enemies who don't care about fairness," he said, his voice sharp, his jaw set. "They will see death, blood, chaos, And you think protecting their feelings in training prepares them for that. You're setting them up to fail. The room buzzed with tension. Some nodded, others avoided eye contact. Brier didn't flinch. Her voice cut calm and even. Preparing someone for hardship doesn't require cruelty. The battlefield will test them in ways we can't simulate. But here, in training, our responsibility isn't to destroy them in advance. It's to build them strong enough to withstand what comes. The officer sneered. And what if they can't? What if the weak slip through because you didn't break them first? Brier's gaze hardened, but her tone never rose. Then the battlefield will reveal it. But until then, our job is not to weed out the weak by pretending cruelty is a test. Our job is to reveal strength in those who don't yet know they have it, to give them every chance to rise, not every excuse to quit. Silence filled the room. Not agreement, not yet, but silence that admitted her words had struck. She continued, "Our enemies will try to break our soldiers. Why would we do their work for them?" Some of the instructors lowered their eyes. Others clenched their jaws tighter. The resistance was far from gone, but seeds had been planted. Later that week, Brier walked the grounds of Fort Dalton alone. The air carried the weight of memory. Every corner whispered Sorrel's name. She could see her sister in the lines of recruits dragging themselves across the field, hear her in the faint echoes of boots striking the dirt. This place had taken Sorrel from her. But now it looked different. The instructors barked with authority but not venom. The drills were merciless but not humiliating. Recruits stumbled, but they were lifted back up by their peers, not mocked for falling. Progress changed. Yet standing on the soil where her sister had once collapsed, Brier felt the ache of what might have been. She should have trained under these conditions, she said quietly. Beside her, Colonel Farrah Quinn, now in command of Fort Dalton, nodded solemnly. Yes, and countless others before her. We can't change that history, Captain, but we can ensure it never repeats. Brier's jaw tightened. History isn't just what happened, it's what we allow to happen again. Quinn studied her, and you've ensured we won't. But Brier wasn't so sure. Shadows still lingered, and the weight of them pressed heavy on her shoulders. 2 years to the day after her undercover mission began, the message arrived. Promotion. Major Brier Merrick, head of the newly established Military Training Ethics Division at the Pentagon, oversight authority across all branches. The ceremony was held at Fort Garrison, the ground where everything had started. Brigadier General Wyndham herself pinned the new rank to her collar, her eyes steady with pride. Major Merrick's contributions extend beyond exposing abuses, Wyndham declared before the assembled ranks. She has reshaped how we understand training itself. She has reminded us that discipline and cruelty are not the same, that building soldiers requires more than breaking them. And because of her, our force is stronger, not weaker. Applause thundered across the parade ground. But Brier's eyes, steady and composed, drifted to the rows of recruits in formation. Young faces, some proud, some nervous, all unaware of how fragile the system they stood in once was. Her sister's face lingered among them, a ghost she carried still. When she addressed the crowd, her words were simple. "This rank honors not just my work, it honors every recruit who endured, every soldier who spoke, even when silenced. And it honors my sister, Sorrel Merrick, who deserved to wear this uniform but never got the chance. Her death was not a statistic. It was a warning, and that warning has become our reform." The silence that followed was deeper than applause. It was understanding. That night after the ceremony, Brier walked once more to Sorrel's grave. The stars were sharp above, the air biting cold. She removed her new insignia, pressed it gently against the headstone, and closed her eyes. "You outrank me still," she whispered. "You started this fight with a report no one heard. I only made sure they finally listened." She pinned the insignia back to her chest, standing taller in the moonlight. But grief remained, not dulled, not erased, simply carried. Back in Washington, her new office was bare except for two items: a framed quote on the wall: "Strength builds, abuse breaks, know the difference," and a photograph of Sorrel, smiling in her uniform, frozen in the promise she never lived to fulfill. On her desk, a thick folder already waited: reports from military medical training programs, whispers of the same patterns repeating there. Different field, same shadows. The work wasn't done. It would never be done. She opened the folder, read in silence. Her face betrayed no fear, no weariness, only quiet determination. The kind that outlasts cruelty. The kind that builds legacies. Outside her window, a new class of recruits marched past the Pentagon's ceremonial entrance. Their faces were diverse, their strides uneven but determined. Once, some of them might never have made it here. They would have been broken before they began. Now they moved forward together, unbroken. Among them, one young woman caught her eye. She carried the same quiet fire Sorrel had once carried: determined, watchful, silent but not weak. Brier held her gaze through the glass for a moment. Different face, different name, but the same spirit. And Brier knew this was why she fought. Because silence, when carried long enough, becomes legacy. And legacy is louder than cruelty ever was.